Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the next phase, which is episode 24 of season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the 5th season episode, The Next Phase. So the next phase is the episode where the Enterprise goes to aid a Romulan science vessel that is severely damaged. Ro and Geordi beam over and they try to beam back to the Enterprise with a piece of equipment, but they're seemingly killed in a transporter accident. However, we later find that they are in fact alive, but they are cloaked somehow, or actually phased is the more accurate term, as they can move through walls, tables, but unfortunately no one can see them. They try to find a way to return back to their regular form, and they find out that the Romulans were experimenting with this experimental technology of phasing, which went wrong, which is why their ship got destroyed, and they don't want the Enterprise to find out, so they sabotage their warp engines so that the next time they go into warp, they'll explode. And Geordi and Ro hear this, however, because they're out of phase, no one can hear them, and they can't warn anyone. So Riker and Data hold a funeral for Ro and Geordi and 10 Forward, and so Ro and Geordi take this advantage to try to create a lot of technobabble fields and stuff so that Data and the other engineer will technobabble them back into existence and get them back into phase with the rest of everyone, which works. And Geordi warns the ship at the last second, warns engineering at the last second not to go to warp, and explains what's going on to Picard, and then they all celebrate that they're actually alive. So, I really liked this episode, and watching this again this time around, I actually liked it better than I remember. But I always liked this. I always enjoy this. I think it's a fun action adventure, an interesting sci-fi concept, and it's the kind of stories that Star Trek do very well. Now, let me at first just get this out of the way up top. Let's get this out of the way. Yes, it makes no sense why Geordi and Ro don't just fall through the floor. They go through tables, they go through walls. We see the Romulan even goes to a bulkhead to go into space. So why is the floor any different? Why do they not just fall through the floor? We actually see Ro lying down on the floor, and later she wrestles the Romulan on the floor. So why is the floor solid to them but not the walls or anything else? Now, I personally don't care, but that is a plot hole, and a lot of people bring it up. Some people let it interfere with their enjoyment of the episode. I do not. But it would have been nice if they just thrown in just a quick line of once they found out they were out of phase, of Ro being like, well, why, if we're out of phase, why don't we fall through the floor? And Geordi could be like, oh, it's because of the gravity deck plating technobabble tech bullshit that keeps us steady even though we're out of phase. And I can headcanon it to that be the case. So it's part of the reason why it doesn't bother me. But it would have been nice. That's all I'm saying. It would have been nice if they mentioned it. Now, people mention other flaws as to how can they still breathe the air? How can they still, I don't know, how do they react to their environment and stuff like that? But stuff like that actually doesn't bother me. I'm perfectly willing for Starfleet's, fake science or whatever to go along with that. The air is still breathable even though they're out of phase, and they can still interact with some things. I don't know, but the floor thing, to me, that is the obvious plot hole here. But again, I am totally willing to hand wave that away. These are not the plot holes you're looking for. So I'm perfectly fine with that. Because I do really enjoy this episode. Because not only is it a really good, like, suspenseful, interesting sci-fi concept, it's also a good character story. And that's what I like most of all, is good character stories. And when you combine all these things together, I think it makes a pretty damn satisfying episode to watch. Now, another thing this episode does that I have railed against in the past is that it does a death fake out. It has the characters think that one or two in this case of the main characters have died, when we the audience can clearly see that they're alive. I complained about this a lot in the episode The Most Toys when they did the death fake out for Data, and I stand by that death fake out really does not work for me, and it kind of ruined the episode because they're mourning over Data, and Worf is refilling his position, and Geordi's going through his shit and giving it away, and they're crying about how, they'll miss Data, but we can see he's clearly alive. And so for me, that was very frustrating and annoying. So I think even when I reviewed that episode, The Most Toys, I mentioned that the next phase does this as well, but I don't mind it there, and I don't mind it here, because I think it's handled differently. I think there's a difference because in The Most Toys, they were sort of like showing how depressed they were and how much they missed, how sad they were that Data was gone, and I can't believe he's gone. Whereas in this case, it seems to me that they focus more on sharing memories of like Geordi and Ro, which is giving us more backstory on the characters. So to me, that's a bit different. But the other thing that's very different from that episode is that Geordi and Ro are actually there in the room when people are saying this, and so they're hearing what people are saying about them once they think they're dead, so that affects their characters more, it's actually a really interesting thought experiment and a really interesting character beat that Geordi and Ro get to listen to what people would say about them after they died, and that is something you don't get in The Most Toys. The Most Toys, when they're all crying about Data being dead, just seems like a giant waste of time because we know that Data is not dead, whereas in this episode it reveals character beats. They mention backstories about them, and it also develops their character because they're hearing what the other characters are saying about them, and that will affect how they view these other characters going forward. So it's a lot more interactive, and there's a lot more ins and outs, and there's a lot more effect on the characters themselves rather than, oh well, he's not dead, let's just take everything back. So that's why I differentiate between The Most Toys, where I hated that trope, to this episode where I actually really like it, and it actually really works for me. It's also interesting that they went the avenue of Ro thinking that she was dead. I think that was also a really interesting twist on it, but Geordi, being the scientifically minded kind, of course would not believe that immediately, and because this is Star Trek and it's all technobabble rules, he ends up being correct. And I do like that Picard also has that similar mindset, because at the end of the episode, when Geordi and Ro do that quick flash in front of them, and Picard's first thing he says is, "They're not ghosts. What just happened?" He's like, "I know there's a logical explanation for this," and that's cool. I like that, and I think it makes sense with their characters. But Ro comes from more of a spiritual people, which will be, of course, explored a lot more in Deep Space Nine. Not Ro, but the Bajoran people. Unfortunately, Ro didn't survive to go. I mean, she didn't die, but didn't move on to Deep Space Nine like the writers wanted her to, but because of the actress, didn't want to do it. But even though we don't get much more Ro. In fact, she only appears 2 more times, and once is Rascals, where Michelle Forbes only appears in for 2 minutes, and the rest of the time Ro is portrayed by a different actress who's actually child actress who's not good, but that's something I'll get to when I get to that episode. And so really Ro only has one main episode after this, Ro as we know it, and that's her final appearance in Preemptive Strike at the end of season 7. Although there's Star Trek Picard as well, but I'm not really going to talk about that here. But yeah, the Bajorans were shown to be spiritual, and so it makes sense that she would have that outlook of actually believing, even though she says, I never took much faith. I didn't believe in Vorhas, which is apparently the Bajoran word for souls. But her upbringing still came back when she was faced with, when she sees Dr. Crusher and Picard talking about how she died, and sees Dr. Crusher filling out her death certificate and nobody responding to her and people walking right through her. You can kind of get why she would actually, that would be like a sort of traumatizing experience or a spiritual experience where she would turn to these beliefs that she had long since abandoned. And I think that was a really interesting character beat for her. But as I said with Geordi, he's the engineer, he's the tech guy, the science guy, so it makes sense that he wouldn't buy that he's like, there must be a technobabble explanation for this, and of course there is. And so I think that I love the dynamic between these two characters, between Geordi and Ro. I mentioned this before. Ro is one of my favorite characters, and it's a shame that she only appeared in 8 episodes, or I believe it was 8. Yeah, because and that is unfortunately because Michelle Forbes didn't really want to do TV, which is unfortunate because she's so amazing in this role. But I talked before about how they should have actually hired someone else, even though there's no doubt in my mind any other actress they hired probably would not be as good as Michelle Forbes. At least they would actually want to do the show. If you hire someone who actually wants to do television, then they could have had Ro on more. But anyway, so it's interesting getting the interaction between these two, because you don't really get this pairing before with Ro and Geordi, and to be honest, I like it a lot better than Ro and Riker. I talked about this in my review for Conundrum, that I wasn't that big of a fan of the pairing between those two characters, and I think that the Ro and Geordi pairing worked a lot better. And it's also good because they fumbled Geordi's character a lot. This is something I talked about before in episodes like Booby Trap and Galaxy's Child, where they make him like this fumbling idiot who doesn't know how to talk to women, where here he's like works like jives with Ro very well. In fact, I kind of think they could have had a little something going on between the two of them. That might have been interesting. And so I like it when they write for Geordi like this. I think it is much better that way. And speaking of characters that are written well in this episode, let's talk about Data. Because Data, I've mentioned before in episodes like In Theory, that sometimes writers do not know how to write for him correctly, and they write him as a beep-boop-bop robot, which the best writers know how to use Data correctly, which is to have him be an android, a non-feeling, non-emotional android, but have this spark of humanity, have this spark of love and curiosity and showing some human emotions, but through his non-feeling android lens, if that makes any sense. It makes sense to me. It's just harder for me to describe it. But like episodes like The Offspring do that very well. And there's several other episodes just can't think off the top of my head that portray him correctly, that shows that sense of humanity. Like that scene in Identity Crisis where he was trying to deny the fact that he was extra motivated to save Geordi because he was his best friend, but Dr. Crusher was kind of getting it out of him. Like that's the good shit. And here we get the well, it's not just the one scene. Like throughout the whole episode, how he deals with Geordi's death and planning the funeral. But really, the best scene is the shuttlecraft scene between Data talking to Worf, and of course Geordi and Ro are there, but of course they don't know that because they're out of phase, and Data's planning the funeral and asking Worf for advice, and Data's going on about how, I've never really understood friendship until Geordi, and he was like, it really, I really explained what it means to have a good friend. And, Rose says something like, he sounds almost human, doesn't he? And I'm like, exactly. That is the best way to write Data. And it makes him a lot more interesting and a lot more fascinating. And that conversation between Data and Worf is just so good, where Worf is, explaining, well, the humans do this and the Bajorans do that, but you shouldn't ask me for advice because Klingons look at death as a celebration, as they happy for him that he moved on to the next life. And that's also very interesting. It's a good insight into Worf. I didn't mention, by the way, yet that this episode's written by Ronald D. Moore, and he's been one of my favorite writers, and this is kind of the reason why. This is such a well-written episode. In terms of characters. Now, yes, there's the plot hole with the falling through the floor, but to me that's not really important. It's funny because if you watch my videos, speaking of conundrums, sometimes plot holes do bother me, and they do affect me. And Darmok is another case where plot holes do interfere with my enjoyment of the episode, but I think there's different circumstances if the plot hole is just too much to overlook, or maybe it's just my own personal taste is just too nagging at me, whereas this plot hole, hand wave, perfectly fine to ignore it. But my point is the characters are all written so well, and it was interesting getting Picard's reaction, Patrick Stewart is such a fucking good actor. So in the opening scene, when they're dealing with the Romulan ship is about to be destroyed, and Ro and Geordi just died, as far as they know, but they're in the middle of a crisis, and everyone could die. More people could die, like Riker and Worf, and everyone else on the Romulan ship could die, and so they're in a crisis, and they need to handle it. And what I love about this performance from Patrick Stewart is that when Picard's informed that Ro and Geordi are dead, you have this moment where he gives this look, this very quick, and it's a very quick moment. I love it. It's like a quick beat, blink and you'll miss it. But I love these subtle sort of implications, and he gives this look where you could tell how devastated he is that he just lost Geordi and Ro, but they're in the middle of the crisis, so that look is only brief, and then boom, he swings into action because he needs to, because he's a trained Starfleet officer, he's a good captain, he does his job, and he makes sure that no one else dies, and then they have time to grieve for Geordi and Ro later. And I think that's amazing. And the conversation he's having with Beverly, where Beverly is in denial, is well, maybe you missed this and maybe you missed that, and Picard has to lay down the hard truth and be like, look, Beverly, they're gone, just face it. And yeah, that's just good storytelling. It's good character story. Now, as far as the thread of the week with the Romulans, it's interesting because apparently there was a man, every year, Renee, I always get his last name wrong, Echevarria, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Renee Echevarria, one of the writers, I was watching a commentary he was doing on the episode I, Borg, and he was talking about how every year there's a list of things that they for the writers that they prefer they not do stories about. Like, in most seasons, not all, I think season 3 especially, time travel was one, even though they did yesterday's Enterprise. And they have, like Data falling in love, people were against that, but eventually did in theory. But one of the things apparently in season 5 was Romulans. Michael Piller did not want to do Romulans. He even said that in a quote about this episode, that he feels like Star Trek Next Generation has done Romulans enough and that they're coming kind of tired. Now, season 5, of course, did Romulans in Redemption Part 2, but that was concluding what was set up in season 4, the cliffhanger that they had to resolve, and also Unification, but that was the big Spock cameo, and so it made sense to have the Romulans there. But I think, though, other than that, I think those are the only 2 Romulan appearances until this episode. And apparently Michael Piller, he said that he didn't want to do Romulans, but he saw the script of this episode, really liked it, so he approved it, even though it had Romulans. And I personally don't understand that mindset. Romulans are the main enemies of the Starfleet. They've been shown to be the main adversary of Next Gen, so why not use them more? I think they should have used them more. If anything, I don't think they used the Romulans enough, but that is just me. But thankfully, they didn't use them in Ensign Ro, because they were going to be the ones oppressing the Bajorans, and God, Deep Space Nine would have been so different if that was the case. But thankfully, they decided to bring back the Cardassians, and that I agree with. That was the really right thing to do, but I think they could have used the Romulans more. But anyway, I think they worked for this episode. It's funny that when you compare this episode to Timescape, one of my favorite episodes of TNG, there's sort of a flip side here, because in this episode, they go to the aid of a Romulan ship that is in distress, and they want help from Starfleet, but it turns out that they're actually up to no good, and they try to destroy the Enterprise, whereas Timescape is the inverse of that, where it appears to be that the Romulans are up to no good and attacking the ship, but it turns out that they're just in distress and they need aid, and they just want aid from Starfleet. So it's like the exact reverse of this episode, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, the Romulan who was phased, that was kind of there for plot convenience and to push the plot forward so that Ro can get a disruptor so they can use it to, get data to flood the tin forward with the tachyons, whatever the hell it was. The Romulan wasn't there that long, but I think I still liked it. I still, it was, the Romulan appeared, and then shortly after, Geordi threw him into space, and that was it. We get a, fun little chase scene between Ro and the Romulan, where they're running through the guest quarters and running, right over people the dude is exercising and shit like that. But I liked it. I think it added this element to suspense. And I remember that moment where Geordi and Ro are in the Romulan ship, and they just walk off, and then we see this. They show this Romulan sitting in the seat, and he's just sitting there looking like that. And then at the end, after Geordi and Ro leave, they're like, "Oh, we gotta stop the Romulans or whatever." And then you see the Romulan that we were showing in that seat get up and walk through a table. That was a fucking chilling. That was a chilling reveal, which I loved. So even though they didn't do that much with the Romulan, it did lead to suspense that I think actually really worked for the episode. Now, of course, the main suspense was held through the Romulans trying to destroy the Enterprise, and that put a ticking clock on Ro and Geordi needed to go back into normal phase immediately, otherwise the ship would be destroyed. And I think that was brilliant writing too, because that added that time crunch, that extra layer, which ramped up to the suspense, which I thought was really good for the episode. Now, another interesting concept is I was thinking about how Riker said he wanted to talk about Ro during the memorial service, and Ro was like, "What? What are you going to say about me?" And it's funny, when she's at the memorial service, she like shoots the face into his head, but since they're out of phase, of course, it does nothing to him. But she's like, "God, now I guess I'll never get to know what you were going to say about me." And to be honest, I was a bit curious myself, like, what is it that Riker would say about Ro? But I'm going to have a special treat for you. I am going, because I figured out exactly what Riker was going to say, so now I'm going to give you Riker's speech of exactly what he was going to say about Ro at the memorial service. When I first met Ensign Ro, I didn't want her on the ship because she was, an outlaw. She was in prison for doing this thing that we're never going to tell you about exactly what she did. But I didn't want her on the ship, and when she came on the ship, she was insubordinate. She was just a bitch to me all the time, constantly arguing with me and not listening to anything I told her to do. But then there was that time where we all lost our memories, and she was really into me, and we banged a couple of times, and since then, I think she's okay. So, that's what Riker's speech was going to be. that is what Riker was going to say at Ro's memorial service, and no one can tell me otherwise. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, yeah, so I just think that this episode, especially that ending when they're in 10 forward and they're like, "Can you see us?" Like, and then Data was like trying to figure it out, and I love this because you have scenes like this when Data's like figuring shit out. Like I talked about, Mind's Eye was a really good one where he's figuring out that Geordi was brainwashed, or he's, there's other examples that he's putting things together and the audience is like, "Come on, Data, do it." But here we actually get a character cheering Data along. So like, "Come on," where LaForge is like, "Come on, Data, put it all together." And when he starts putting together, he and Ro are like getting really excited and hugging each other. I love that. I think that just added such an extra flavor to it. I just think it was really good. And that scene we get with Geordi and Ro at the end, it was a bit cheesy because Geordi says, "Well, we should get one of these phase things because if it teaches Ro learn humility, it can do anything." And then they do the cheesy laugh, like, which is kind of a cheesy way to end the episode. But I did like that connection between Ro and Geordi. I think they had good chemistry together, and I think that should have maybe they would have if the character of Ro actually stuck around, which unfortunately she did not. But yeah, I thought it was a really good way to end the episode. But speaking of the phase device, it's interesting because Geordi was talking about when he was realizing, he was saying, "Oh, we heard that the Klingons a few years back were experimenting with this, phase technology, and it destroyed their ship and whatever, and perhaps that's what the Romulans are trying to do right now, which is why their ship got severely damaged." And that's very interesting to think about because the episode Pegasus in season 7 reveals that there was a couple of conspiracy of admirals that in secret built this technology. I believe it was like 12 years ago, something like that. So it was a while ago. The Starfleet actually did it first, but for them it was illegal because they had a treaty with Romulans forbidding them from exploring cloaking technology. So it's funny that Starfleet actually got there first, but it was just illegal, so they couldn't tell anyone about it. But it shows how much Starfleet's better. Anyway, I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters very much for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel, and I am very grateful for everyone's support. I would like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neil House. Thank you so much for all your support throughout the years. And I would also like to give a shout out to Intarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Michelosio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "The next phase, more like the next nays." JK, I don't remember this episode, so I might have liked it, I guess. I'll find out when Mark does this review and talks about how it's his favorite episode of Trek besides Endgame. Yeah. God damn it. Anyway, you know how much I love Endgame, don't you? Anyway, next comment is from Antarius. He says, not the first and not the last time the crew thinks someone is dead, but this maybe is the best implementation of this theme. Patrick Stewart did a great job playing Picard, who is deeply moved by the loss as he continues to carry out his duties. Certainly, they should also float through the floor, but they can't do that so that the episode can happen. Hey, that's my line. So the episode can happen. If this Romulan mission was really that secret, it would have been more fitting to the way Romulans are normally portrayed. If they tried to repair the ship by themselves or use escape pods and destroyed the ship instead of asking the Federation for assistance. My rating is an 8 out of 10. You know, I actually like how they asked the Federation for, because as I said, it was that twist. You made you think like, oh, they're being nice and they're building this relationship with Starfleet. Now they're actually deceiving them. They're shady fuckers who are plotting to destroy the Enterprise. It's a nice little twist, and it fits in Romulan's character, I believe. Oh, by the way, I haven't mentioned yet that one of the Romulans, actually all three of the Romulans, this is on Memory Alpha, are played by actors who appeared in Star Trek multiple times. Like the dude, he looks so familiar. He played the Romulans. He was on a lot of Star Trek episodes. Like he played the old guy, scientist guy in The Thaw, the one that was killed, and he also played Kira's father in that flashback episode that showed his death. And then, but more importantly, and I even noticed this in the credits where it says Susanna Thompson. And I was like, Susanna Thompson's in this episode because I recognize her because she played Lenora Khan in the DS9 episode Rejoin, as well as playing the Borg Queen on Voyager, except for Endgame because they got Alice Krieg from First Contact back for that. But the other appearances on Voyager of the Borg Queen was Susanna Thompson, so I recognized her immediately. I think I had heard a while ago that she played a Romulan in this episode, but I totally forgot. And because of the makeup, it took me a while to recognize her, but as soon as she started talking, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see it. That's her. And the other dude did the Romulan that attacked Ro. I think he was just in a couple other episodes. Oh, he played Croesus in Descent. That's probably his biggest other role. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, I've always liked this episode, even with the two major illogical parts. Deanna Troi can't read people while they're cloaked and didn't sense that the Romulans were scheming something. Answer was given in this episode. Remove Deanna from the rest of the episode as she was recharging her superpowers in her quarters. Geordi and Ro must have put on their gravity boots on before going over to the Romulan ship. I would have loved to know what Riker was going to say about Ro. I think I know, and I will save it for my out of 10 comment. I love the scene with Data and Worf in the shuttlecraft. This proves without a shadow of a doubt that Data isn't a robot. Thank you. But as we both know, there will be some people who will not agree. For example, if you ask 1,000 people in the poll, that the sky is blue or grass is green, there will be about 5% that will not agree with that. That's very true. As it's the cool thing to do nowadays to disagree with logic and even facts. I was going to give a name, but I think you know who I'm talking about. Well, that actually could apply for a lot of people. My rating is 8. This message was deleted by Patreon for extremely explicit language out of 10. Although I like my version of Riker's speech better, but it's just similar. It's similar. So if Geordi and Ro were wearing gravity boots, the gravity boots would have been out of phase too, and those still shouldn't have worked. But anyway, but that's a good point about Troy's superpowers. Not only because in the episode when Ro and Geordi, the transporter accident still happened, Picard specifically asked Troy, "Do you sense anything?" And she's like, "No." Why not? Like, if they're still on the ship, what? Just because they're phased, she can't read them? Like, I don't know. That she can't read them if they're phased, but still they don't fall through the floor. I don't know. I don't really get the logic here. But I didn't think about the Romulan part too. Is that because she's been shown before to be able to sense deception in Romulans? Why couldn't she sense it here? I don't know. Yeah, it did do this too much. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, "Ignore physics and logics and just enjoy the ride. I do wish Geordi and Ro weren't quite so heavy on the exposition dump, though." 7 invisible Bajoran crew members worrying about what Riker is going to say at their memorial service out of 10. Remember what Ro and Will Riker did in Conundrum? No, definitely remember that. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, "I like this episode a lot due to it being focused on Ro and would unfortunately be her last episode until the penultimate episode. Yes, I know she appears in Rascals, but that was more of a cameo. Anyways, I like the concept that Geordi and Ro are invisible and they work together to get out of this phase. Also, I really like the chemistry between Ro and Geordi. Feel like they could have been a good couple. This episode's pace is also good as it never drags or speeds through. One thing I don't like is the cliche that everybody has a funeral and thinks the main characters are dead, and they really are not. So my rating is an 8 out of 10. Yeah, I usually hate that trope, but I didn't mind it so much here, personally, and totally agree about Ro and Geordi, just saying. But that's a good point, though, about the pacing of the episode, that it is good pacing, that it never drags or rushes. Like, it hits these character beats that are important. I think that's maybe part of the reason why I like this episode so much. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, "This is in my top 3 of Ro-Laren episodes. I guess Preemptive Strike is number 1, and I'll go back and forth between this one and Ensign Ro for what ranks second. I really love the whole cycle of Laren's growth in this episode, her apology to Picard, her frustration of what Riker would have said, and I especially liked how she and Geordi eventually worked well together, though at first Geordi was determined, as always, to find out what was really going on, which he most certainly was successful. Yes, there are questions about gravity and the placement of being phased, including how they were able to go in the shuttlecraft. I just dismiss it with the ambitious Romulan technology that I guess somehow keeps phased people grounded while still going through the panels and walls, etc. And I guess in this other dimension, oxygen is still breathable, of course. I like Data's role and how he did his best to come up with a New Orleans-style, vibrant funeral, and there is a good humorous moments. I assume the Romulan was the missing captain, boy, Romulans seem to always be duplicitous until maybe the chase and most certainly Timescape. Although because of the similar situation and what the Romulans decided to do this episode, no wonder we generally assumed the Romulans were up to no good in Timescape. I like how they had that whole scene where both Worf and Romulan officers worked together without having to remind us of been past sworn enemies. I guess O'Brien was off making a movie this week. I would expect O'Brien being more inquisitive than this transporter operator, that's for sure. The Bajoran death chant, didn't you wish there was one for Kaiopaka or Bareil or Kira's fellow Bajorans who died in darkness in the light? Maybe even for Kira's Cardassian dad, where she finally was getting over her grief issues she was trying to avoid. Hey, we had an opportunity with Shax and Lower Decks in a comical moment, but considering what happened with Shax, maybe better off. I'll give it 9 out of 10 Dimension Laser Blast into Riker's Temple out of 10. So yeah, 9 out of 10. There we go. The death chant. I will say, I do believe that they actually did do the death chant for Kaiopaka. In the episode Battle Lines, when Kaiopaka died on the planet, the first thing Kira does is she's crying and weeping, but she leans over Opaka's body, like, holds her body and starts saying words in Bajoran. So I assume that this is the Bajoran death chant. So I think, and that was my first thought when I first saw that episode. I'm like, hey, they're actually doing the death chant, because I remembered it from this episode. Now, in this episode, they say that the death chant is 2 hours long, but, shortly after, Mike Ehrentraut from Breaking Bad shows up with a bunch of 90s bikers, and of course, so that interrupts her, so she couldn't exactly chant for 2 hours because of that. And you could even say that maybe she did do the death chant for Bareil. She just did it off screen, because after all, they didn't actually show Bareil dying. He was going to die. They knew that for certain, but she was sitting there, telling stories about him. But maybe after he actually did die, maybe she did the death chant. We do know that she was doing these other rituals mourning for him for several months, so maybe she did do the death chant. Or maybe the show just forgot about it after season 1 of DS9. Probably more likely. Anyway, yeah. So, yeah, the thing about oxygen and whatnot, that doesn't really, as I said, that doesn't really bother me so much. O'Brien is a good point, though, because actually, when I was watching this episode, it occurred to me that that transporter chief that we saw was probably written to be O'Brien. It seems like it would have made much more sense to be O'Brien, so I think the most likely explanation is that it was written as O'Brien, but for whatever reason, Cal Meany was not available that day for shooting, so they had to get someone else, so they just put in a substitute O'Brien because she was helping Data and going over the transporter logs, and that's usually something O'Brien would do. But anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for the next phase out of 10 is going to be a 9. Excellent. Now, I was going back and forth between an 8 and a 9. It seems like, several Patreon supporters gave it an 8. Let's see. About 3 of you, and Norman gave it a 9, so I'm actually siding more with Norman. I was going back and forth between 8 and 9. It was either going to be a strong 8 or a weak 9. I think I'm going to go with a weak 9. Because, it's not an absolutely amazing episode. It doesn't blow me away or anything. It does have that plot hole about the floor, but I think the more I talked about it, the more I realized that this is a really well written, a really good, well acted, well written episode that has good character moments, as Ricky points out. It has good pacing. It has good chemistry between Ro and Geordi. You get moments with Data, you get moments with Picard, and it's engaging throughout. It's an interesting sci-fi concept that they take the most advantage of and have some like intrigue and suspense thrown in there that work. And the satisfying conclusion when everyone sees that they're still alive. So, yeah, I'm going to give this episode a 9 out of 10. I think this is definitely the highest, higher than I've rated it in the past. But yeah, as I said, I liked it better this time around watching it. So, anyway, that is it for my review of the next phase. So, let you know what's coming up next on my channel. This Thursday, I'll be over on Patreon for my Patreon supporters to do a revisited for The Inner Light. Oh, what a great episode that is. So we're looking forward to revisiting that. If you're a Patreon supporter, definitely check that out on Patreon. Saturday, I'll be reviewing the much hated and aligned The Acolyte Season 1. As the recording of this video, I'm only halfway through the season, so I don't even know what I think of it yet. But we'll definitely review it then. And then on Sunday night, Monday morning, as usual, we'll be reviewing House of the Dragon, this time covering Season 2, Episode 6. And then on Tuesday, I'm back over on my main channel for another public Star Trek review, this time reviewing Time's Arrow, Part 1 and 2. And then the following Thursday, I'll be ranking all the episodes of Season 5 of TNG. Always looking forward to those types of videos. So anyway, that is what's coming up next on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek The Next Generation and many more shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.